Wizard101's Ice School has a problem. The problem being that people play it. Okay, I'm just kidding about that one. Ice is a good school, and there's certainly fun to be had with it, but of all the other schools in the game, Ice feels the most whelming. I would say Myth is pretty up there too, but that's for a different video. Today I wanted to talk about the problem with Ice, and offer my take on how it could be made into a more interesting school. This video is 1000% inspired by Kaiser Noah's Ice video, where he talked about the same thing. But I'm going to talk about some very different ideas and concepts here, and it's going to be nothing like the stuff he said. Ice has a problem, and that problem is there's almost no practical reason at all to use it. If you play Ice, your damage is low, you lack good utility, and your main gimmick, which is shielding and taking, is almost worthless in team settings. Taunt is a spell that would work wonders for Ice in theory, but pulling aggro is something that's very hard to beneficially pull off in Wizard101, because half the time enemies just use AoEs, and if you taunt an enemy and they just choose to do an AoE anyways, you just wasted your turn, and it's not really beneficial. Oh, and by the way, did you know that Life can get more max health than Ice? Ice is technically the tank class, but by the endgame, Life ends up having more health. Ice does end up getting the best resist, which is fine, but at that point, Life just does anything Ice does, but better. This is a point that Kaiser Noah mentioned, and I agreed with him totally when he said this. Why would you shield yourself from hits at the cost of low damage when you can have good damage, better health, and just heal back your lost HP instead? Literally just play Life or Death, and you have a better version of Ice right there. This doesn't mean Ice isn't fun per se, it can be very fun. I like how it kind of makes you chip away at your enemy's health. I like how it makes you put more thought into your fights, because insta-killing often isn't an option. But I have some ideas to make Ice more engaging, fun, and have a stronger identity within Wizard101 other than being a hard mode, so let's get into it. First, I want to say that this idea is unrealistic. This would never happen and is a complete overhaul of one of the game's core schools. But this is for fun, so why not make crazy changes? Second of all, I'm a PvE player, and this idea is for PvE. It's probably an awful idea for PvP, so just keep that in mind. The first thing I tried to think of when thinking of what would make Ice better is what are the characteristics of Ice in the real world? And what I came up with is Ice is cold, sometimes sharp, but melts if left out. Put some ice in your drink and it makes it more refreshing. But wait too long and it can melt and ruin the drink. So what if Ice was similar in Wizard101? In my proposed Ice changes, Ice would keep its absurdly low damage and high health, but would receive a new mechanic called Melt. Ice users could cast charms and wards that help out significantly. I'm talking like 70% Blade, 40% Pierce Charm, 80% Ice Trap, etc. However, the catch for such strong charms and traps would be that they melt. The first turn it's casted, it keeps its initial value, but after the player's first turn passes, it drops from say 70% to 35%, then 20%. And then finally, if the charm isn't used in the allocated time frame, the charm will fully melt and deal 5% of the caster's max health back to them. And if the charms were enchanted in any way, they'll deal 10% instead. I believe that this is a pretty good idea because I think it would truly change the playstyle of Ice compared to other schools. Right now, Ice typically tries to do the same buff yourself until you can one-shot that other schools do, but with the melt mechanic, Ice would be highly encouraged to hit often and hit small, making the entire chip away playstyle much more reliable and rewarding. To correlate with the chip away playstyle that I'm talking about, I think I would give Ice the highest Pierce stat in the game. It makes sense, right? Icicles can get pretty sharp, so I think it makes sense that Ice can have high Pierce. It also makes sense mechanically wise, because it would truly allow Ice to focus on doing lots of short bursts of damage. If they have a naturally higher Pierce, they're more likely to just try to hit through shields instead of using a wand hit or something to try to break through the shield. This version of Ice that I've created is all about all-out attacks with little to no prep time. Something else I thought of with these proposed changes is that it would make bubble spells extremely relevant for Ice. When you don't have time to do a lot of setup, it would make popping a bubble at the beginning of a boss fight much more helpful than bubbles have ever been. And I always love excuses to use spells that don't get used often, so I think this is a good way to do that. But let's be real, even if Ice had that kind of change, Wolf Stormblade is still hitting on a full team. While I think it gives Ice some more reliability independent to itself, I would want Ice to lean more towards being a support school. It technically is now, but it does a bad job. Here's what I propose to change that. Ice would be given a universal melting Blade, Trap, Pierce, and Healing buff, which would allow for a very strong buff for allies of any school type if timed correctly. This blade would function like the normal melt blades that Ice would have, and if they're not used in time, the melt damage would apply to the caster instead of the user. So players who are buffed by Ice Wizards wouldn't have to worry about taking melt damage. If this kind of change was made to Ice, I believe it would make Ice actually wanted on teams, and people wouldn't dread seeing them on Team Hub. This would allow them to supply decent buffs and help out the team in a very unique way. This could be a very powerful tool if your team communicates properly, but I think there's more we can add that can make Ice truly have a unique team role. Another big part of Ice's current identity is shields, and I would say that Ice should keep its shield, but also apply a melt mechanic to them as well. Say Tower Shield would start as a minus 70% shield, go to 50, and then 30. That just sounds like a worse Tower Shield, you might say. Well, it would be, but I'd also propose that this shield would not break when damaged. Rather, it would revert to its next melted phase. So if you cast the 70% shield, someone hits it, instead of breaking, it would go to a 50% shield. And then if someone hits that, it would go to the 30% shield, and then it would break. So if you time this kind of shield well, you could shield a player from 3 separate hits in one turn. It would work just like the melt blades, so if the shields aren't completely used, the Ice Wizard would take a percentage of their health as melt damage. Now I will say, I think this idea would be a little bit overpowered if every school could train it, so I think maybe make these melting spells Ice exclusive. Maybe have like 1 or 2 that the other schools can get, but I think for like this version of Tower Shield, I think it would work a lot better if it were to replace something like Legion Shield. Next, I want to talk about some spells that Ice has that are currently pretty useless. I'm mainly referring to the Taunt and Freeze spells here. Taunt is a spell that makes your enemies aggro you, but for aforementioned reasons, it isn't very reliable. My proposed fix to Taunt is to make it like a mini Shadow Sentinel instead, which means that whenever an enemy is taunted, if they attack someone who is not you, you'll tank 5 to 10% of that damage for the player. I think it makes sense too, like the enemy meant to attack this other wizard but was so mad at you that they gave you some of the damage. Now I want you to imagine this scenario. You're supporting a team of 4, 2 different taunted enemies use an AoE, plus a blade you had melted, and a shield you had on someone melted. Between the taunt damage and the melt damage, you would be taking a lot of damage in one turn, which all of a sudden makes Ice Gigantic Health Pool something that makes more sense, and something that you can even gamble with. You can support your team incredibly well, but if you aren't careful, you can die absurdly fast because of it. And with Ice's lack of healing capabilities, there isn't much you can do once your damage is taken. Lastly, I want to say how I would change the freeze spell, or any stun utilities Ice gets really, because what freeze is, it just stuns an enemy. The problem is, stun is completely useless. 90% of enemies in this game can't be stunned, and I think stunning is just a bad mechanic in general. I think it should be done away with, especially if it's not going to work. So in this scenario, this is how I would change the freeze spell. Instead of stunning an enemy, freeze would cause one of their hanging charms to receive the melt effect. The charm won't lose value, but it will damage whoever has it if it isn't cleared in time, basically forcing enemies into hitting or losing their charms and taking damage. Now imagine a spell like Frost Giant with the freeze effect instead of stun. All of a sudden, Ice doesn't look so wimpy anymore. So those are basically all my ideas for Ice. I'm really curious if anyone else likes these ideas or if they're just plain stupid. But I do think these would bring identity back to Ice and make it almost like a combination of life, balance, and death. Some of the damage prevention of life, some of the support from balance, and some of the self-damaging gambles from death. And most importantly, I don't think these changes would make any of those schools irrelevant in comparison. Life can still better maintain the team's health, balance can still buff the team more, and death, well, let's be real, nothing is replacing death ever. So what do you think of the idea? Would you play Ice if it was like this? Let me know. This has been Sap of the Spiral, and I will see you later, Wizard Gators.